what can we divine from the statement that they've made?
Well, European regulators think that there is an antitrust problem in the market. It thinks that there isn't enough competition, that there isn't enough transparency, and that this is ultimately hurting markets because it doesn't open. It's harder for companies to get the kind of to get as much as they need, the information they need, or regulators have already talked about this in other areas in creating regulation for credit default swaps, and this is where they think that there might be collusion, there might be agreements that unfairly shut out competitors.
All right. Now, what does the fact that the EU issued a statement on this subject mean? How far along is the investigation, and what would the next step be?
This is a big deal. It shows that there's a formal probe. The next part of it would be a formal complaint. And further
something
down the
like
line,
a complaint being something akin to a lawsuit that we might see from the SEC here.
And if the companies will have a chance to defend themselves, but if the Commission still sees problems, they could bring in fines, and those can be pretty big fines.
Now, help us to put this into context. European government officials certainly have complained about the way that the CDS market is run, that there's excessive speculation. They haven't focused those complaints on any particular dealers. Can we draw any connections here between those statements and the EU antitrust probe?
I think this is more serious. This is more technical. I think the statements we've seen before have been very broad, often by people who didn't know exactly what they were talking about. This is a lot more specific. It's about information to one provider to market. It's about deals with one clearinghouse, ICE. So they know what they're talking about. They know what they're going at. This is a lot more serious than the statements we've seen before.
Now, we here at Bloomberg have focused our attention on a couple of names, Goldman Sachs and JPMorgan to be specific, because they are big players in the credit default swap market. But I want to be certain that the statement that we receive from the EU does not draw any distinction between which banks are facing any more scrutiny than any other. Is that correct?
No, there's 16 of them, and there's lots of Europeans in there too. There's BNP Paribas, there's Barclays, there's Credit Suisse, there's two Germans, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank. It's a pretty wide probe. It's all the big players in the market, not just Goldman Sachs and JPMorgan.
And as I understand it, they're looking at two things. They're looking at whether there was collusion with a data provider known as Markit, M-A-R-K-I-T, just so that everybody understands what we're talking about, over perhaps whether or not these banks provided information to Markit that they weren't providing to others. And then there's a separate concern over whether or not they shut out certain banks from participating in the credit default swap market by virtue of an agreement or suspicions of an agreement with one of the big clearinghouses.
That's right. The first one is about information, CDS information that went to Markit, which gave Markit a position of some kind of control, apparently. And the other one was about clearing, and it was deals with ICE, Clear Europe, and the kind of clauses and the fee structures that might have encouraged banks only to use ICE. And clearing is one area where the Commission has said several times it doesn't think there's enough competition.
Aoife, thanks for joining us. I know you're slammed on this story and you'll return to your reporting. Aoife White joining us to talk about this brand new investigation just launched by the EU against 16 banks, including Goldman Sachs and JPMorgan, over the credit default swap market.